Okay, hello and welcome to tonight's edition of Scholars Who Teach, the faculty showcase in our admitted student programming. For those who haven't tuned in before, my name is Topher Bordeaux and I'm an Associate Director of Admissions here at the college. As you're no doubt aware by now, one of the distinguishing aspects of a Dartmouth education is the access that students have to faculty who are both leading scholars in their fields and also teachers and mentors in your classes. So every Monday through Thursday over this month, my colleagues and I will introduce you to a few of the people who embody that scholar-teacher model here at the college. Tonight, we're joined by Professor Michael Herron from our Department of Quantitative Social Science. Professor Herron will share a bit about how QSS can inform the study of election integrity. Before I turn things over to Professor Herron, I should encourage everyone to drop any questions that you might have into the Q&A as you think of them over the course of the session. We will leave some time at the end to answer as many questions as we can. And with that, I will turn things over to the professor.
Topher, thank you so much. Good to see all of you. I'm going to share my screen now. And I'm going to speak today about a project on election integrity involving the state of Georgia. After I talk a little bit about QSS and sort of quantitative research in elections. This paper that I'm going to talk about was co-authored, and I just want to give credit to my co-authors here, David Cottrell, Felix Herron, and Daniel Smith. I write with a number of these people about election issues. Okay, so now let's get rolling. So I'll talk first about teaching research at Dartmouth and QSS. That's the program in quantitative social science, as Topher mentioned. Then I'm going to talk about the study of election integrity and what I'm doing in this area. Then I'll talk specifically about the 2020 election in Georgia and why Georgia is interesting. I'll explain how people cast votes in Georgia. Turns out that's really important to this paper. Then I'll give you some results about this paper. This paper is essentially an audit, which I'll explain in a second. And it uses what are called residual vote rates, and I'll explain what those are as well. And those involve undervote, overvote rates. You'll learn all these terms, and then that'll be it. So as Topher said, please feel free to ask all sorts of questions. All right, so a few things sort of philosophically about sort of how I approached research and teaching, as well as some QSS comments. I see these two endeavors as completely complementary. I think that's sort of consistent with the mission of Dartmouth. In this institution, we offer liberal arts education, which involves asking questions and also exploring answers. What we know about the world is that how we answer research questions isn't static. And QSS has played a role in this. QSS is a relatively new program at Dartmouth. It's essentially applied data science, if you want to think of what we're doing. The program started in 2015. It has grown dramatically since that time. There was a precursor to QSS at Dartmouth, really for like 30 years, so really ahead of its time. In 2015, sort of the program was effectively rebuilt. And now we have this sort of very vibrant curriculum and many students working in it. So it's a fantastic opportunity. You know, I'm teaching a QSS class right now in game theory. And often in these classes that come up, and I'm teaching, people ask the question like, well, what classes do we take here? And so just sort of give you the sort of sense of where I'm coming from. I suggest that people take classes in sort of lots of areas, but sort of broadly construed like QSS and philosophy. And sort of the idea here is the way I see the world is you take classes in QSS to understand what the world is like, and you take classes in philosophy to understand what you're going to do with this information. So in other words, QSS tells you about what we might call the state of the world. And another area of study like philosophy, but I'm obviously speaking of political theory, that teaches you about justice and like what you do with your knowledge. And it's in the liberal arts ideas, you need both of these. And so I think QSS fits very nicely in that sort of mission. So I'm happy to take all sorts of questions about QSS later and sort of how the program runs and what you can do with it. I should mention that the research enterprise is a really central piece of QSS. Every student who goes through the program does a research project. Many write theses, and some do shorter projects because a thesis doesn't fit everyone. But research is not optional in the program. I believe, and like my colleagues who helped me run this program, believe that it's not good enough just to teach people how to study the world. You need to teach them how actually to learn something new. And it's, when you do a homework problem or problem sets, answers to those things are new to the student, but they're not new to the faculty member. But when you do research, you are learning something that is literally new. And I think that's really exciting. And we want to teach students in QSS, like that's what you want to aim at. The reason you're taking these classes is because you're trying to learn something that is new and new in a broad sense. Okay, so enough of that for the moment. Now I'm going to talk about what's going on in this paper, and I'll situate it first by mentioning this paper, which is about the Georgia election in 2020, is really about election integrity. This is a subject that obviously is very prominent these days because of the debate around the 2020 election. In the academic world, people have been working on election integrity for many years. I would say in the past 10 years in particular, there's been a lot of interest in understanding things like voter fraud rates, and what we can learn about studying procedures. That's much more recent. Where that comes from is this notion, as mentioned in the slide, that free and fair elections are really key to democracy. So that really isn't a debate, at least in the academic community. And so the literature on this has sort of tried to ask questions like, well, what exactly is a fair election? And so often people, if you sort of think about this idea, there's sort of a couple different aspects of this. One is eligible people can vote. And when I say eligible, of course, those criteria vary across states, but for federal elections, they're common, at least in the United States. Ineligible people cannot vote. That's another key piece. And the third is that administration, and administration encompasses many different aspects of elections, follows laws and established procedures. Okay, so what do we mean by election administration? And I use that word here carefully. Some people would describe my area of research right now as election administration. This encompasses issues like voter registration procedures. It encompasses ballot formats, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, and voting technology, to just mention some areas, along with issues about like how mail ballots are handled and so forth. In the United States, as you probably all know if you've been paying attention with the 2020 election, most election administrative decisions are made by the states. They're not made by the federal government. They're made by states, and in some states, they are then devolved to counties. And so one of the areas that people are interested in is things like within states, like how much uniformity there is in laws and procedures. And we ask that question within states and then also across states. Okay, so after an election is over, it's one thing you can do is have an audit of an election. So most people agree that this is like a natural feature of an election, like audit should be part of a post-election aftermath. The question is like, what does an audit mean? Because one natural feature, well, maybe not natural, one feature of elections in the United States is that certain data are public and certain data are not public. So I'm just calling those private. The private data, I don't mean private to individuals like a vote choice. That, of course, is private because of ballot secrecy. But I mean certain data on, allocation of resources across the state. So in some states like Florida, I'm going to talk about Georgia in this case, but I've done a lot of research on Florida. Florida laws are very open, it turns out. Some of you might be from Florida, so you know this. So you can find out a lot of things about Florida elections just from asking public officials and getting data from the public. In other states like New Hampshire, where I live, it's not the case at all. Many aspects of elections are known by the government or local governments, but are not public. And so audits sort of can sometimes fall in between this area of public data and not public data. We sort of see this debate in Arizona. I put a question mark after Arizona because this audit is sort of caught up in some of the election debates about whether there was fraud in 2020. I've been involved in some of these debates. There, of course, no evidence of this in a widespread level. People are working on papers on this now, but that's what everyone has found so far. So I have a question mark at that, but there is this sort of question about what's going on in Arizona. It is a form of audit data or auditing using private data. Again, I don't mean private like individuals, but known to the state. In any election, there are many, many issues that can be audited. So sort of thinking about what I talked about earlier, is an election fair? You can ask things like, well, could ineligible people vote? So how would you figure that out? Well, you might ask the question, how many people, or how can we estimate the number of people who tried to cast ballots but couldn't? perhaps because they didn't have identification, or because the lists on which their names should be were inaccurate and the people voted provisional ballots, and then were not counted. A provisional ballot, for those who don't know, is a ballot. These are federally mandated that an individual can cast if there are questions about registration, and that ballot is held to the side and is counted later. Those are called provisional ballots. And there's research on understanding how many of those are counted and how many should be counted. So that's really how you could ask about eligible people voting. How could you ask if ineligible people voted? That's a harder question. In principle, you could do a study of voter lists and try to understand if people on lists actually were eligible to vote. For example, were people in Georgia who voted actually residents of Georgia? You can imagine data analysis like that. And you can also ask about whether the election was administered in a clean way. Obviously, I'm sort of what does clean mean? I mean, again, sort of consistent with laws in any particular state. So some of these issues are really challenging because we don't have lists of people who we might want to know, or might want to be interested in. For example, suppose I give you a state like Georgia and say, tell me all the people who voted in this election, if any, who weren't residents of Georgia. Well, that's a really hard question to answer because we don't have things like a list of residents of Georgia. In the United States, there are no things like that. There are no lists that have residents in this fashion, and that makes that challenging. So if you're interested in sort of understanding how you can study these things, I'm just going to give you reference to a paper I wrote after 2016. A lot of people were interested in election integrity then because of allegations that Donald Trump made. Now, obviously, the allegations were much, much broader in 2020, but they were made in 2016 as well. So you can see how David Cottrell and Sean West are two colleagues of mine. We tried to get at this question of how could you estimate the number of, say, non-citizens who voted in 2016? So there are ways to try to get around this. But nonetheless, those are challenging subjects. Okay, so that's the basic framework here. Let me now talk about the 2020 election in Georgia. And you might ask, well, why Georgia in the first place? So remember now, Georgia's really in the news because of a new voting law. That did not motivate this paper. This paper was written a long time before that voting law was, well, I'm not in the Georgia legislature. So when they were considering it, that's a harder question. But this paper predates that law. We were interested in Georgia really for a couple of reasons. One, it's a battleground state. So people who are interested in election integrity in the United States want to study the election across the entire country, want to study patterns of voting in the entire country. But there's obviously focus on states that might be pivotal in the Electoral College. So as we all know, given the Electoral College system, certain states are more likely to be pivotal than others. And so we're interested in those sorts of states in general, because, one question you might want to have is if there's ever evidence of some problem in an election, a natural question is did the election outcome change? Now that's a separate question of voting rights. Some people want to ask the question, as I do in some of my work, are someone's voting rights, inhibited or diminished independent of whether that person's vote or that person's state's vote might have been pivotal in an election? So those are separate issues, whether voting rights are maintained and whether a state or a vote is pivotal, in other words, decisive in an election. For this paper, we are interested in Georgia because of its status as a battleground state. In addition, of course, as we all know, the COVID pandemic changed election administration across the country. None of this is new to anyone here, I'm sure. In fact, this is true across the world. There are all sorts of studies of elections across the world now taking place during the pandemics and trying to understand how it is that people's willingness to be exposed or not to potential disease affected their willingness to vote by mail or vote in person. So that was, I would say, a feature not unique to Georgia, but certainly there. Immediately after the election in Georgia, you may remember, there were many, many claims about voter fraud, and we wanted to respond to them. So this paper, and what I'm going to show you the data, is not about fraud per se, sort of a more general audit. But nonetheless, that put Georgia in the news. As you also know, this was the locus of Donald Trump's phone call, at least the phone, it's one phone call to the, I believe, Secretary of State, trying to, depending on one's interpretation, generate additional votes. So you can call that under claims of fraud. Now, why were people interested in Georgia, and particularly why was this phone call made? Well, presumably because the presidential result there was very close. So this is, again, this question addressing this issue of being pivotal. People are more interested, for better or worse, in election integrity in states and localities that might actually be decisive to election results. Another feature of Georgia, which I will use this in the data analysis is going to come, is that if you remember, there were 2 United States Senate races in Georgia in 2020. That's very unusual. Normally there's only one. There was a regular race and there was a special race. And it turns out that that distinction has some interesting consequences. And that's because of a quirk in Georgia law. So just to give you a little sense of this, it turns out that in regular Senate elections or regular elections in general, in Georgia, there are primaries. And in special elections, there are not. So why is that important? That means in special elections, you tend to have a lot of candidates, not just a few candidates that won primaries. So that plethora of candidates is a challenge for displaying on a ballot. So we'll see the consequences of that in a moment. But because of this feature, 2 Senate elections, 1 regular, 1 special, there was an interesting feature of Georgia. I can tell you that when my colleagues and I started this project, we were not focused on this Senate race, either of the Senate races. We were really interested in the presidential race and claims of fraud. We ran into this Senate thing, you'll see it in a moment what I'm talking about, and thought, oh my goodness, here's something we better study. So it's sort of a nice feature. Sometimes when you write a paper, you sort of know upfront what you're sort of trying to do. This was not that case. We didn't know that the Senate race aspect of Georgia would be so prominent, but you'll see that it is. Okay, so what happened after November 3rd, 2020? That was the date of the general election. Again, this may be old history for some of you. Maybe some of you live in Georgia. So there was at first a hand count of the presidential race. We can't get all, it turns out all the data are not available for this because of the way the recounting was done. This was what a hand count means that ballots were taken and classified by hand and put in boxes, literally, or areas based on the presidential vote. And so the point of a hand count is that the ballots were not read by a machine. So it turns out that in Georgia, everyone eventually creates a paper ballot, either by voting on a machine that generates its own paper ballot or by voting by a paper ballot, say, by mail. So in Georgia, everything ends up in paper. That's not true of all states, but many. So the hand count refers to literally hand counting these pieces of paper. Okay, so that was immediate after the election. And then the votes and the presidential race were recounted. Okay, that means they were fed through the machines. Now, of course, both of these audits are essentially recounts, but one is different. One depends on hands and one depends on machines. If you look at the data from the 3 counts, which is the original count, the hand recount, and then the machine recount, they were all very, very similar. They weren't exactly the same. This shouldn't surprise everyone. And this issue always comes up in matters of election integrity. Election is recounted and the number of votes changes a little bit. And someone says this is fraudulent or represents fraud. And I can tell you that there is a literature on recounts and it finds nothing like that. Recounts always find slightly different numbers. Why might that be the case? Well, in a state like Georgia, where there's, say, millions of votes being counted, if any process has if you want to think of it as an error rate of, say, 1 over a million, for example, you might expect something like 6 votes to change. And most processes, we would accept if someone said this process is right with the exception of 1 over 1 in a million, counts, that would sound pretty good. Obviously, if an election turns on 1 vote, then 1 in a million is big. But in general, elections don't turn on margins that close. So the recounts in Georgia were completely consistent with what people have found in other studies of recounts across the United States. As I mentioned, there are types of audits. And the other point I mentioned about the aftermath is this new voting law, which I'm not going to talk about today because it's not relevant, but it is part of the aftermath, so I wanted to mention this. Okay, so what could you audit here? So I haven't talked about what I'm going to audit, but what could be audited? So what I'm going to do is study what are called residual vote rates. Okay, so a residual vote refers to a vote that does not count. And I want to be careful about what I mean by does not count. Okay. Before I talk about that, let me just mention other possible things you could study in an audit. You could study what are called rejection rates of mail ballots. Now, when I said does not count, talking about residual vote rates, I want to contrast that with a rejected ballot. Residual votes, as I'm going to explain in a second, are not rejected ballots, and they are not rejected votes. Okay, nonetheless, when you mail in your ballot to a jurisdiction, it can be rejected. It can be rejected depending, the criteria vary depending on where you live, but they can be rejected on the basis of being late, a mail ballot, or not having a signature or some other abnormality. In some states, if you have someone assist you to vote in voting, you have to have a witness signature, and if you don't have a witness signature, your ballot gets rejected. Okay. Another form of audit could study voting lines. This is traditionally very difficult because there's often no data on lines. So if you were to ask me how long on average people have to stand in line to vote in Georgia, we don't know. And it's not that we don't know because it's private. It's like this information just is not maintained basically by anyone, particularly in large states. You could have another audit, a bulk question is like whether newly eligible voters were able to register to vote. And you could study issues about voters with disabilities. Okay, so these are the sort of things that could be audited. Now I want to return to residual vote rates. What exactly does that mean? A residual vote is one of two types. It can be either an undervote or an overvote. Okay, an undervote is like an abstention, but I put it in quotes because an abstention sounds like you're choosing to abstain in a particular race. So when I say an undervote, let's think about the presidential race for a second. I could go to vote for the presidential contest and I look at it and it's Trump versus Biden. Say, I'm like, I don't care. I'm not voting for any of them. I'm simply going to skip the presidential race. Okay, that's called an undervote. Now, what I just described is as if I'm intentionally abstaining. Now, you might look at me, Zoom or not, and it's like, no one does that. But I can tell you, we know that's not true. In every election people have studied, people regularly undervote and they skip the top race. So the presidential undervote rate is typically small, under 1%, but it is not zero, basically pretty much anywhere you look. Okay, the reason I put abstentions in quotes is we know that it is sometimes the case that people abstain, but they don't intend to abstain. So that's why abstention is in quotes. So what can happen there is a particular ballot format can lead someone to not see a particular race and to skip it. So we know this happens sometimes, particularly with electronic voting machines. If the races are arranged in a certain way on a screen, that sometimes people don't see the race, a small race underneath a big one. So that can lead to an undervote. I don't sure you'd call that an abstention, even though the person is abstaining, but you wouldn't call that an intentional abstention. Okay, that's why abstention is in quotes. An overvote is more than the number of allowable votes for a race. So for example, I go to vote for presidents, I see Trump and Biden, and I vote for both of them. Okay, and you might say no one does that, but I'm telling you, people do that all the time. Now, in certain voting machines, you're not allowed to do that, but if you're voting on paper, you can vote for as many people as you want. When I say you can vote, it doesn't mean your vote's going to count. I guess I should say you may vote. Your vote doesn't count. If you vote for more than the number of allowable candidates, that's called an overvote. Okay, so that's an undervote. So now you see undervotes and overvotes. Neither undervotes nor overvotes are valid votes, and hence the residual votes in an election, in any race like the presidential race, consists of the number of undervotes plus the number of overvotes. Okay, so the reason we care about residual votes is we know from other literature that when you have a lot of residual votes, it looks like people had difficulty registering their preferences. So that's an administrative statement. Okay, it can also mean, in principle, that there's something weird going on, because we know there are always undervotes, in some cases overvotes. So if I ever saw an election and there were no undervotes, that would be strange too, unless I knew that everyone voted on machines that prevented undervotes, because we know that people voted. We know that people undervote all the time, even in races that you might think it's crazy, no one does it. We know people do it. And we even know that people hand in blank ballots sometimes. They take their ballot and they just hand it in. That happens rarely, but it does occur. The scholarly interest in undervotes and overvotes dates to 2000. That was the contested presidential election. Before I get to some data, let me mention a few more things here. We use residual votes because we know when we see a lot of them, that indicates problems with an election, but we also know residual votes can be intentional. For example, undervoting, abstaining. Another thing is that residual votes can only be cast by voters who turned out. So if you think that some feature of an election that should be audited prevented turnout, you will never see it by studying residual. You will never see it by studying residual vote rates, because you can't cast a residual vote if you didn't turn out. So any turnout problems will not be picked up by this. And similarly, if mail ballots are rejected outright, as I mentioned before, perhaps they're late, or perhaps they have signature problems or witness signature problems, those also don't contribute to residual votes. So this audit, as I'm describing in this paper, is like one aspect of the election in Georgia. There are many things it can't cover just because the potential number of things that could be audited is large. I gave you a few examples about that earlier. Okay, we do not know what, in general, what an anomalous residual vote rate is, except because, as I mentioned, we know that we see residual vote rates, in particular undervotes, all the time. And we also know that when races, the interest in races varies. So what I mean by that is, in some races for typically House seats, they're not really competitive, even if there are multiple people running. So we know that people this often skip those races, generating very high undervote rates. Some races only have one candidate, not the presidential race, but a lot of House races have one candidate. People often skip those things. So that generates undervotes. So we know that sometimes when undervote rates are high, it's not bad, it's because voters just didn't care. And so that would be consistent with intentional abstaining. It's not obvious how you could say that with overvotes. Those seem anomalous or problematic regardless. Okay, so what I cannot do is look in Georgia and say, okay, the appropriate residual vote rate is 1%. We can't say that because we don't know it. What we do instead is we look at comparisons across races, which you can think of as what are called natural experiments. Okay, natural experiment means an environment where we have observational data, like what I have now from the election. It's not experimental. There's no random assignment of candidates or voting, but I have two races and I will treat them, those two races, as comparable as if that's a natural experiment. Okay, the setup for this is getting long. I apologize. I just got to give you a few more context and I'll show you some data, what I think is going on in Georgia. So it turns out in Georgia, as I mentioned, people, in-person voters, vote using voting machines, what are called the ImageCast 10 machines that generate paper records, but mail voters fill out paper ballots. That's an important distinction because Georgia's voting machines prevent overvotes. So if we see an overvote, we know it wasn't done by an in-person voter. It must have been a mail voter, and that's M-A-I-L voter. Okay, this is what, for example, Cobb County's presidential race looked like. You could skip voting for this race. That's an undervote. You could vote for all three candidates. You could vote for 4 candidates and write in a name. That would generate an overvote in the presidential race. Okay, so what happened in Georgia? There were 8 statewide races. So the Georgia ballot had many, many races. I'm focusing on these 8 statewide ones. These are in order of they were on the ballot. You can see that the president was the first race, then the Senate regular. I mentioned 2 Senate races. They were called the public service districts. These are races in Georgia. Then there were amendments and a ballot referendum. I have this dashed line to indicate that these 3 races, the amendment and the referendum, were way at the end of the ballot. So these were the top 5 races. I'll focus on that. These are the number of votes. So on this column called votes, this means valid votes cast. This gives you the number of undervotes and overvotes and what is called the residual vote rate. So the nice thing about Georgia is they tell us the number of undervotes and overvotes. Many jurisdictions don't, so we couldn't distinguish. All we know in some jurisdictions is the turnout rate, is the number of people who voted and the number of votes. And so we know the residual vote rate, but we can't break it down. In Georgia, we can. So one thing to notice, by the way, is there were a lot of overvotes in the Senate special election. In fact, 7,814, which is very large. So I earlier mentioned we don't know what the right numbers are, for like the appropriate numbers. What you can see here is there's something strange about the Senate special election and overvoting. If you look at the residual vote rate, these numbers are like pretty typical. This is actually a bit low. 0.38 is lower than we typically see in the for presidential residual vote rates. Sometimes it's like 1% of people skip voting. So these rates are very typical and they tend to go up pretty much monotonically as you go down the ballot. But with the exception of something weird going on in the Senate special election. So now I'm going to talk about residual vote rates for these races, and then I'm going to break it up, my results, into undervote and overvote races. So my co-authors and I gathered data at the precinct level and the county level, and one way that people in this literature do is they compare residual vote rates across races to see if there's any problems. So for example, what would be a problem? Well, if we observed in some set of counties in Georgia, some counties that had extremely high residual vote rates in the presidential race, but very, very low residual vote rates in the Senate race, that would make us think that something strange was going on in one of those races. So these plots in the x-axis, you see the presidential residual vote rate. Every point here, by the way, is a county in Georgia, and the size of the county is proportional to turnout. So the bigger circles mean counties with more turnout. So, and the x-axis is the presidential residual vote rate. And this is for the left panels for the Senate regular election, and the right panels for the Senate special election. And what do you observe here? This is a 45-degree line. So every point is above the 45-degree line, meaning the Senate residual vote rate in every county was greater than the presidential residual vote rate. We see that all over the country. So that's normal, meaning as people move down from the most important race, some of them stop voting right away. Nonetheless, it is slightly bizarre. You might say that you have this increase in residual voting in the Senate special election, but not in the Senate regular election. Nonetheless, you might say, well, there are a few small counties that had elevated residual vote rates here. We weren't really sure. My co-author and I saw that, like, this on the right panel looks strange. We don't really know. It's not obvious. I've seen stranger things, put it that way. If you look at the precinct level, so Georgia's divided into thousands of precincts. We look at, these are histograms of the residual vote rates in the president race, the Senate regular election, the Senate special election. If you look at these things, these distributions look really nice. So if something were very, very puzzling or very, very wrong in a precinct, you would see you would see a right tail in these distributions that looked really strange. And we see a right tail here that is longer. It's a little bit skewed, but it's not so skewed that you obviously would say there's a problem here. And again, I've seen other examples from other races and other places where you get a really far right tail. So a lot of skewness out there. So these sort of residual vote rates, again, these are histograms of residual vote rates for the presidential race and Senate races. These don't look really strange, although this is a little bit puzzling in the Senate special race. Okay, so nothing particularly unusual, okay, which, from an audit point of view is good. Now, of course, this is a science matter. I don't want to say good like we want to see this, whether we see it or not is ultimately a positive question. And by positive, I don't mean the opposite of negative. I mean, the goal of an audit is not to make a normative statement, it's to describe or to make a positive statement about what's going on. And so we saw nothing. Okay, now let's break down the Senate special election by county. It turns out what's happened there is that the overvote rate in the Senate special election, and we can tell from the Georgia data, is really unusual looking in one place, Gwinnett County. So some of you might know Gwinnett's a large county in Georgia. You can see that because the circle is very large. I don't mean large geographically, I mean with respect to voters. So the point is these little dots up here, yeah, okay, they're small. So, for those of you who study statistics, like, sampling variance is inversely proportional to the square root of n. So that cannot explain Gwinnett County. Gwinnett County is a very large place, lots of turnout, but a really high overvote rate. Over here, these are all other statewide races. What you basically see about overvote rates is they are practically zero. They're not zero, right? These points are not on the x-axis, but they're really close. So this told us when we started doing this paper, there is something strange in Gwinnett County. And we didn't know what it was, but there's something strange. So the first thing that we thought, and I'm going to run out of time quickly, so I'll just mention this fast, is that the concern was that the problem was ballot formats. So we know, and I already mentioned this, that the way you display candidates on a ballot affects what people do. We would like that. That shouldn't be true, at least shouldn't in a normative sense, but we know that it is. So some of you might remember the butterfly ballot. This was in 2000 that caused misvotes, people to vote for one candidate rather than someone else. There's a famous example in Florida in the 13th Congressional District in Sarasota County. If you want, email me later, I can send you the paper on this. That led to undervoting just because of the ballot format. And then some of you, if you're familiar with like the Senate race in Broward County, Florida, there was another strange ballot format there. And there are lots of other places. It's not just Florida. So I don't want everyone to like get upset with Florida. This happens all over the place. It's just we can study Florida well, and because people focus on Florida, because if its status as a battleground state, we pay attention. So here's what happened in Gwinnett County. So if you look at this panel, on the left side, you see Gwinnett's ballot. On the right, you see Bibb County. Bibb County is another county in Georgia. The red circle and the green circle highlight what happened, highlight the Senate special election race. So what you see on the left is there are 2 columns of candidates, and what you see on the right is there is 1 column of candidates. We have not been able to get ballots from every county in Georgia, although we've tried. It is our understanding that the only county that had 2 columns was Gwinnett. Okay, now why are there so many names? It's because of this quirk in Georgia law that I mentioned earlier. When you have a special election, you don't have a primary. And so there are many candidates. It may be difficult to read, but if you look at this carefully, you will see that there are multiple Democrats in both columns and multiple Republicans. So this means if you were a committed Democrat or a committed Republican, and you think, and your view is, I'm voting for every Democrat I see, or I'm voting for every Republican I see, you would overvote in this county by accident. You should vote for all the Democrats, or say all the Republicans. That could happen here too, but it looks like they're 2 different elections. And so we've seen things like this in the literature. When you display names like this causes problems. One of the issues in Gwinnett County, it turns out, is because of the Voting Rights Act, they have to have multiple languages on their ballot. So if you look up here, there's a lot of instruction. It may be difficult to see this. I hope you can see my mouse. There's more instruction. That's because it's in Spanish and English than over here where it's only in English. So so what happened is that Gwinnett gets sort of stuck. They have to have more instructions, but they have many candidates. And the result is something like this, which is that in the Senate election, there were 4,564 overvotes in that one county, and there were 3,250 overvotes in the entire rest of Georgia. And that's because of that ballot format, which I wanted to start. We didn't have any idea this was coming. We were interested in the presidential race, right into this. Okay, so what we think is going on is that this ballot format caused these overvotes. So that's the result of an audit. Okay, so how can you really see this? Now I'm going to end it quickly. In this panel, we have the Senate special election, okay, in Gwinnett County, in all other counties, and then we have overvotes and undervotes. And so what you can see here, and the x-axis, we have votes cast by mail. So if you look up at the top here, and these upper panels, the overvotes in Gwinnett County, this sort of cloud of points is sort of, up like 45 degrees practically. The idea being the more votes cast by mail, the more overvotes. Okay, what if you go to the other county, the rest of the state? It doesn't look like that at all. Okay, that number is relatively flat. In undervotes, you see the same pattern. Okay, so this is this natural experiment intuition. So this tells you that something with Gwinnett is different with overvotes, and we think it was the ballot format. But if we think it was the ballot format, then it should be, if we look at other elections, we don't see this pattern. So now I'll show you the presidential race. In the presidential race, you see the same pattern in Gwinnett as in everyone else. And it turns out if you can look at other races, you see the exact same thing here. So just if I flip back and forth, so again, we have Gwinnett on the left, everyone else on the right, overvotes on top, undervotes on the bottom, and Gwinnett and non-Gwinnett look very similar here. But if I flip back to the Senate special election, they don't look similar. So that would tell you that the Gwinnett County effect was limited to that one race. And so that's the place where there were 2 columns. Okay, so where are we? All right, as my students know, I tend to talk too much. So it's a hazard of being a professor, so give me another second. We saw this ballot format led to overvotes only overvotes in that special election. We estimate there were like 4,243 net votes were lost by Raphael Warnock, He was the Democratic candidate for Senate in this election. You know that name because he is now a United States Senator. This was not pivotal in the election, which of course is normally a very good thing. Anyway, okay, I have a few more things to talk about, but how about I open up to questions now? And I think I've gotten across the basic story, what I tried to tell. So thank you very much. Topher, I'm all yours.
Thank you, Professor Herron. Yeah, wow, we really got into that. This is really cool. Thank you. I've just been scrolling through the questions here, and to everybody on the call, I dropped Professor Herron's email in the chat shortly after he mentioned emailing him. So we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but if you have one that's not answered this evening, feel free to just shoot him an email, I think. But an interesting one here from Leila Jacoby, sorry if I butchered your name, about the nature of the research that you do itself. She asked, to what extent is QSS research driven by what data is available? Has some research you've done relied on data you chose to collect yourself, and what inspired this?
Okay, that's a great question. I would say it really depends on faculty member. So my work is on elections for the most part. So I often use publicly available data, but other people in the QSS work with experiments. So if they would be interested in more, like, for example, suppose you have this question about ballot formats. You could imagine putting people in front of screens and having them fill out ballots and seeing the rates at which they make mistakes. So that might be a randomized experiment. And there are a lot of faculty members in QSS that do those sorts of things. So I think that would fall under your category of generating your own data. I can say in election work as well, like the sort of stuff I do, it often involves putting together data sources from very disparate sources. So for example, in Georgia, that didn't come up in this particular paper, but every county in Georgia, not surprisingly, might have its own way of dealing with a particular aspect of election administration. So the exercise of studying those places requires a ton of data work to try to make the different counties worth of data similar. I've done work in Texas. This is a huge issue in Texas where there are 200 some odd counties across the state. They all have slightly different administrative procedures. And so that data exercise is very large. I would say, yeah, so I hope that answers your question here. I'm happy to, if you have additional ones on that aspect, email me.
A different kind of question, kind of outcome oriented. An anonymous attendee asked, what are some career paths for QSS?
Great. And by the way, Topher, I'm happy to stick around as long as all the questions we have. I would say people in QSS are going into any sort of data science oriented job you can imagine. So I'll just give you a few that I know of. Some end up working in New York in sort of the more finance side of things. Some end up working for data analysis consulting companies that then have them work on different projects. So there's a firm in Chicago, which I know of very well, called Civis, that has hired some people from QSS. They do projects for candidates. So a lot of candidates will want to understand sort of the data world, and rather than like employ a data analyst themselves, they will go to a firm that collects data analysis, and QSS has applied people to that. I can tell you some people have gone to graduate school. We have a number of students this year getting masters in data science following QSS. And I would say it really spans, it's incredibly wide right now. And one thing that's really interesting about the data science role, or data science job, is that it's so broad. I should also mention that we've had a number of people going to work for sports teams. So I teach a class in sports analytics. So Phil Hanlon and I, you may have heard, he's the president. He and I developed this class in sports analytics, which is a QSS course. So I do some work in that area too. And we've had a number of students go to work for teams. And that's been pretty neat too, because they've gone to work now. They often don't tell us exactly what they're doing after that because the team data are all proprietary, but they're doing analysis of sports. And anyway, so it's incredibly wide range of things. The idea in QSS is we teach you a ton of different skills, and then they can be applied in many different contexts.
Awesome. And then we have one final question here that actually I think it circles back pretty well to the topic of your presentation. What are your broad thoughts on the Georgia election laws? Josh Paul asked that one.
Which law do you mean? You mean the new law?
Josh just said Georgia election. What are your thoughts on the Georgia election laws? So maybe start there. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me make one comment about new versus old. One interesting thing to think about here. So these are the conclusions that I didn't get to, which is fine. But let's just look at the bottom conclusion here. because there is a law here, ballot access laws. Okay, so this is a really interesting feature of this project, which is that normally we think that it should be very easy for everyone to have access to a ballot, like for candidates. But what this paper shows, and other papers have had similar effects, is that when you have many, many candidates, 20 or something, voters get confused. So one law in Georgia says that when there's special elections, you shouldn't have primaries. And many people say that's a good thing, because if you don't have primaries, then anyone can run. So I think that's a compelling argument, or a strong argument. But another strong argument, and that's what this paper shows, is if you have too many candidates, people get confused and they accidentally invalidate their votes. So how do you balance between these things? Okay, that's not a data question. That question is really about like how how much do you value in access versus the small number of voters that get confused. It's not obvious where you go with that. This sort of speaks to this point I mentioned earlier of like data sciences and philosophy and values. So if your question is about the new law, which in Georgia basically changes access or makes it more difficult to vote absentee, and also, among other things, makes it so that you can't give food and water to people waiting in line. I can tell you there is no data I've ever seen that speaks to any sort of problems that law is attempting to address. So we know of no data that people are forging their absentee ballot requests in a systematic way leading to fraud. I mean, there's just no data on that. And people have studied this on everything. As to why Georgia legislature made it so you can't give food to people. Okay, so what could you argue would be this thing? Well, maybe they are concerned that people are bribing voters by giving them food and water, and they're saying, oh, I'm going to give you something in order for you to vote a certain way. I'm just thinking as a devil's advocate point of view. There's no evidence that anything like that has ever happened. I've never heard of this. There are laws that say you can't pay people to vote. But I've never heard anyone suggest that individuals waiting in line, given water, particularly in a climate like Georgia in the summer, if you have an election, if that would be considered a gift in order to vote. So there's no data like that. So what does that say about the law? Well, I think you can sort of, I would say that the statistical foundations for those concerns, there aren't any.
All right. Well, thank you. Professor Herron, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and to everybody on the call. Thank you all as well. Tomorrow night, we have Professor Tariq Al-Aris. He's the chair of our Department of Middle Eastern Studies. So tune into that if you can. But at any rate, I hope you've enjoyed this. And thanks again to the professor, and have a great evening, everybody. Take care.